Good afternoon to all. Let me introduce me first. My name is Akhila. I'll be the moderator of today's session. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar on engaging the direct Walcott poetry, politics and language organized by Ideas in Progress in association with Pathashala. So at the outset of this event, let me introduce the two organizations that have come together to make this event possible, Ideas in Progress as well as Pathashala. Ideas in Progress is an organization that had been engaging with the society for over the past 20 years, helping to bring out the spontaneity in expression by kindling the aesthetic sensibility within through a creative process. They open up opportunities to engage with artists from various fields, including poets, musicians, painters, sculptors, film and theater enthusiasts to share, nurture, guide, and motivate creative engagement. It thereby attempts to fill the ideological vacuum by spurring original thought in a critical endeavor. Renowned theater practitioner and founder of Abhinaya Theatre Group, Mr. Raghutaman sir, sculptor, painter, and retired principal of Fine Arts College, Mr. N.N. Rimson, National Award-winning Indian film critic and documentary filmmaker, Dr. C.S. Venkateshwaran, senior journalist and former chief of Bureau of the Hindu, Mr. Gauridasan Nair, music therapist, performing artist, professional trainer in Hindustani music, and head of the Department of Philosophy in University College Trivandrum, Dr. T.K. Sanitha, Malayalam poet and painter, Mr. George, are only a few among the many who formed this organization. And coming to Pathashala, it is an informal collective of my friends and faculties which was formed in 2015 to inspire, engage, and involve the academia with the society, thereby trying to bridge the gap between due to the differences of varied kinds. Our focus is on academic engagements, and therefore our target is creating bright minds. We have Somrita Urni Ganguly. She's an assistant professor, a poet and literary translator. She was a Fulbright doctoral research fellow at Brown University, USA, and a fellow at the International Literary Translation and Creative Writing Summer School at the University of East Anglia, UK. Her works has been showcased at the London Book Fair. She has read her works in cities such as Bloomington, Bombay, Boston, Calcutta, Delhi, Hyderabad, Itanagar, London, Miami, Providence, and Singapore. Somrita presently teaches British literature to undergraduate and graduate students in Calcutta. She has 14 academic publications to her credit and is a recipient of the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund Award 2013 and the Sarojini Datta Memorial Prize.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for that very kind introduction, Akila, but I'm not going to be too kind today. I'm a young woman, and I'm a little angry, and I think I've had enough of people that are trying to reduce me to my cunt and to my curves. So I've decided that I'm not going to dance the hoochie coochie to men or men anymore. I'm going to mess with their heads differently. I'm going to mess with their heads cerebrally. Thank you for having me over. I'm really grateful to the organizers, to Deepak, to Akila, and of course to my very dear friend Chandra Mohan, whom we might have lost for a little while over there. But I'm really grateful that you've given me this opportunity, because as Chandra Mohan was trying to tell us before we started, it's not always easy to organize events around poets that aren't Indian in India. And it's obviously also not easy to give space to contrarian voices at such platforms. So I'm really, really happy that I'm here. And of course, it's an absolute honor and privilege to share this platform with another friend, Rafael, who's going to read soon, and with Dr. Arunlal. So I hope I didn't offend you with that brief introductory note at the beginning, because of course I will be talking about Walcott's poetry, but I will also be talking about a few uncomfortable things. And if you are by chance someone that gets hurt very easily, I want to put my disclaimer out there right at the start that it's very difficult to talk about poetry without engaging with the politics of it, without engaging with the personal of it. You know, the deeper you dig, the dirtier your hands get sometimes. So I'm going to try and dirty up Derek Walcott for us a little bit today. I watched Manchester by the Sea a few weeks ago. It's a brilliant film, and Casey Affleck delivered a very powerful, very poignant, stellar performance in the film. But Casey Affleck had also crawled into the bed of a female cinematographer, drunk and without her consent. Casey Affleck had also grabbed the arm of a female producer on one of his sets to intimidate her into staying with him in his hotel room, into sharing his bed. So when I watch Casey Affleck on screen, how can I afford to forget the allegations by these women against him? What do I do with the films of people like Roman Polanski, an amazing director and a pedophile? What do I do with the paintings of Pablo Picasso, a heartbreaking artist and a molester? What do I do with the writings of V.S. Naipaul, a remarkable author, but also a drunk wife beater? What do I do with the poetry of Pablo Neruda, one of the most passionate writers we can ever have, but also a rapist? What do I do with the art of Derek Walcott, Nobel laureate and abuser? What do I do with these brilliant men who are also such terrible human beings? And I don't think I have easy answers. These are questions that I've been struggling with for a couple of years now. I used to worship Derek Walcott. His poems have changed my life in many ways, and I will talk to you about a couple of these poems today. The first one is Love After Love, and I'm going to try and share my screen so you can see the poem in front of you while I read it. So that would be on your screen. Love After Love. The time will come. I start with that, Raphael. So here's where we are. Love After Love. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit, feast on your life. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now and come back to what we were talking about. So this poem is from 1976. And I discovered it at a time when I needed to read these words. Love can be one of the most brutal colonizers. And because you know, sometimes we end up submitting and surrendering to the lover to such an extent that we begin to lose track of who we are, who we were, where we come from, and what our identity is. And of course, this idea of ownership, this idea of colonizing the body and colonizing the mind is very important for Walcott, and we'll come to that in a bit. But for now, if you could talk about this poem. Walcott's poem taught me to invest in myself, to celebrate myself. It taught me that self-love is not necessarily selfish. And if you could see on your screen, you know, he's using this this non-traditional meter, but very lyrical, very tender works to get across this this non-traditional, lyrical, tender, yet radical, yet revolutionary idea of acceptance and self-love. That the idea that your story is worth telling, that your body is worth desiring, that you are worth loving at the end of the day when you're done chasing fame and fortune and love elsewhere. I discovered more of Walcott later, and I'll share another powerful poem with you today. This one's called A Far Cry from Africa. And it's about the Mau Mau uprising, which of the 1950s. It went on from roughly 1952 to 1960. The Mau Mau was a rebel group, and they were trying to overthrow their British colonizers from British occupied Kenya. Obviously, it was a bloody battle because all revolutions are bloody. And lives were lost. And Walcott, in this particular poem, is struck between these two rights, or if we might call it, these two wrongs, which is where you see, that's how the aporia in the text, that's where the aporia in the text is located. So he was definitely against British colonial supremacy, but quite support the extreme radicalism of the Mau Mau. I shan't read the whole poem for you, but I will share my screen once again to show you the poem, and I will actually read the excerpt, read the verse paragraph, which speaks to me the most, and that's towards the end of your screen. If you could look at the last verse. Walcott writes, I who am poisoned with the blood of both, that is the British and the Africans, where shall I turn? Divided by the vein. I who have cursed the drunken officer of British rule, how choose between this Africa and the English tongue I love? Betray them both, or give back what they give? How can I face such slaughter and be cool? How can I turn from Africa and live? I find this dilemma fascinating because it also resonates with me. I will stop sharing my screen briefly so we can come back to the main screen. So both of Walcott's grandmothers were African slaves, and both his grandfathers were white Europeans, and Walcott was Caribbean. So he occupies this very interesting in-between liminal space where he's both insider and outsider. So how does he choose between the African roots and the English tongue that he is committed to? He's defined by this hybridity. I don't think he wants to choose or he needs to choose. He's defined by this dual, conflicted identity. And it resonates with me in so many ways, this schizophrenic life of both being here and not here, and being there but not quite there. As someone who grew up with English as her first language, as an English-speaking Bengali girl in Calcutta, who's interested in Urdu literature and Hindi music, I'm always anxious. This home feels very foreign for me sometimes, and I feel very foreign to this home sometimes. And this is a dilemma that I don't think I can resolve, and this is a dilemma that Walcott can't resolve either, at least in this poem. And I don't think he's interested in resolving it, because this conflict gives rise to beautiful, fraught possibilities. So if I could go back to Walcott's interview published in the Paris Review, this was in 1985, 86, I'll read out this excerpt from his interview. He says, what you are taking on is really not a renewal of your identity, but actually a renewal of your anonymity, so that what's in front of you becomes more important than what you are. And of course, he chooses the English language as that vehicle of exploring this identity. Going back to the same interview again, the one from 1985 in the Paris Review, he says, and I'll quote him, he says, "The English language is nobody's special property. It is the property of the imagination. It is the property of the language itself." So Walcott really was, for me, he was one of the first non-white, non-Indian English writers that I had read. He wasn't American, he wasn't British, he wasn't European. And his writings went on to save me in very many ways, if writings can save people. I've discussed a couple of ways with you here. I could discuss more. And I would only later go on to discover more writers of color who were not Indian, or who were not from the subcontinent here, who were not South Asian, and who didn't come from any Anglophone Anglophone structure either. So I mean, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Neruda, Jean Rhys, just to name a few. So because he was my first discovery, because he was my first love of sorts, I worshipped him. And then the year he died, Chandra Mohan was referring to that incident in 2017. The year he died, I met a man who knew a woman whom Walcott had misbehaved with. And Walcott was her mentor. So he took advantage of that power dynamics. And subconsciously, I believed the narrative, even before having to verify it. I believed it because I have had mentors like Walcott in my life. A piano teacher, a writer, at age 16, at age 18, 22, 24. I've had mentors like him in my life. And I read up more on Walcott, and sure enough, the story was out there. The brazen abandon and confidence with which he approached his female undergraduate student from Harvard for something more than just coffee, for sex. And this scandal, as little literary circles that did care to talk about it called it, this scandal was never highlighted in his obituary, is hardly ever talked about when we talk about his poetry. And there are more stories, of course, all of it in the public domain for us to study today, right? A position at Oxford that he was eventually denied, stories of emerging artists whose bodies he had exploited. And suddenly it struck me that a man who is using his power and his sex and his desperation to silence the voices of so many women, how could such a man be the true voice of representation of other people? Caribbeans, Indians, people of color, post-colonized communities, or other marginal, disenfranchised communities of people. And that is when a part of my world came crashing down, because the higher up on a pedestal you put someone, the greater the fall tends to be. Because frankly, I could never imagine that Derek Walcott, the person who taught me, the poet who taught me how to love myself, was also a person that was abusing women of all ages, but especially my age group, behind the closed doors of his office. And yet this truth was staring me in the face. These two images, they were very difficult to reconcile with, because on the one hand, this was a person that, later in my life, I was not only reading him as a reader, as a devotee, as a fan, but also working on him academically. I love his use of the language, and I'm actually going to quote a critic on him because he says it so much better than I do. This is Dr. George Eliot Clark, from who was one of Canada's parliamentary poet laureates, and he considered Walcott to be one of the greatest English voices of the 20th and the 21st century. And I'll quote what he says of Walcott. He says, Derek Walcott, in my opinion, was the first non-British born poet of English to remake the English language in his own tongue in a decolonized fashion. In other words, he took the former imperialist and oppressive language that was forced upon Black, brown, yellow, and red folks from all over the planet through the British Empire, and used that language better than the imperialists and the oppressors themselves were able to do. He was very much an Aristotelian poet. He wrote lyric poetry, comic and tragic plays, and as Aristotle argued that the greatest poets have to write epic poetry, which, as we know, Walcott did, Homeros. He was a symbol for all decolonizing writers of English and other languages. He blazed the trail for all of us. But what kind of a trail is this? Who is this trail for? Is this trail blazing essentially a gendered activity? Can all of us, women and gender minorities, participate in this sort of emancipatory path, so to speak, that Walcott had opened up in this process of the empire writing back? Is the voice necessarily going to be a male voice, a voice coming from a position of power and stardom? Because what is happening to other subaltern voices? Because if you do not consider women and gender minorities, that is half the population of this earth, to be subaltern, then I don't know what you're talking about. So, I mean, there is no denying the fact that Walcott was brilliant. He is brilliant. His poetry is brilliant. He's one of those voices that has pushed the envelope of what it means to be an English writer, of what it means to be a poet that writes in English, because he demonstrates to us over and over again that English poets can come from anywhere around the world, including from little islands that do not have the Oxbridges to boast of, that do not have museums and monuments to boast of. And yet the other truth was staring me in the face. What do I do with the painfully beautiful poetry of a molester? I found myself facing this question. And this is a dilemma, because can I deny the moment of truth when I had first read Love After Love and felt what I had felt about that poem? Can I deny what I still feel about that poem and how that poem freed me and empowered me? And because it wouldn't be honest on my part to say, yes, I can deny that feeling, I cannot also therefore propose what modern society would call cancel culture. I cannot, cancel out Derek Walcott. I cannot say that we should stop reading him altogether. And yet, what then do we do with the achingly, devastatingly poignant art of monstrous men like Derek Walcott, like Pablo Neruda, like V.S. Naipaul? I've talked to people about this. I've talked to friends who are poets. I've talked to friends who are academics. I've talked to friends who are just readers. I've talked to friends who are women, and a lot of them seem to have suggested that we need to try and dismiss the biographical information, that the text should contain its own context, art for art's sake, as they would say. But I'm sorry, I cannot separate art from the artist. That is too convenient and, in my opinion, frankly, dangerous. You need to talk about the artist when you are discussing art. This is 2020, and honestly, our cultures of silence, our cultures of protecting open secrets are frustrating and they are embarrassing. And this is not just about Walcott, this is not just about Neruda, this is not just about Naipaul or people sitting somewhere far away. This is happening in India right now. We are constantly compromising on what should have been the right thing. We are inviting molesters to poetry festivals, we are including them in anthologies, we are sitting with them on panels. And so, you have these badly behaved men masquerading as publishers and editors and poets, who are getting away with their predatory behavior simply because most of us, a lot of us, some of us are unwilling to acknowledge that these artists that we hero worship are capable of toxic, monstrous deeds. No, you do not have the permission to ask your intern or someone contributing to your poetry anthology or your student to sleep with you, even if you have the Nobel Prize in your bag. Because women and gender minorities do not owe their bodies and their nakedness and their sex to you and to your artist's imagination. Walcott wasn't the first person to break my heart. He's not going to be the last person to break my heart. And I think often of something that he said in his Nobel lecture, and I'll quote, break a vase, Walcott says in that lecture, break a vase, and the love that reassembles the fragments is stronger than the love which took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. I'm sorry, Mr. Walcott, I can't say that much of that love has remained, let alone grown. If anything remains, then it is that haunting memory of the love and just this sort of painful feeling of betrayal. So what should we do with the poetry of Derek Walcott? That is what I wanted to talk about today. And, you know, I don't think these are questions to which we can find answers overnight. I've been looking for answers since that evening in Scotland in 2017, when I learned about Walcott's sexual misconduct. I don't have an answer yet, and that is the most honest thing that I can tell you. But what I can also tell you is, how do I cope with it? How do I still talk about Walcott to my students? How do I still read Walcott? And perhaps, again, I want to reiterate that this is not a solution that I'm proposing. This is a conversation that I'm trying to initiate, and I'm looking for more participatory ideas. What do we do with the art of these monstrous men? Perhaps one way out would be to stop treating these artists as extraordinary. If we treat them as human, people that have human follies and foibles and fallacies, the hurt we go through after these betrayals might be less intense. You know, what if we assume that every artist is guilty until proven innocent? That artists lie, that artists cheat, that artists can be brutally temperamental and selfish, that artists can exploit people and emotions for two forgettable or unforgettable verses on love, that artists are monsters, like all human beings are monsters. And if we start looking at artists as essentially flawed, we might be able to deal with their transgressions better. But having said that, I also know that this is possibly a practice that is easier said than done. This is more theoretical than practically possible, or at least for me, because that is the nature of art. That is the nature of worship. I've always treated these writers, these poets, these artists as heroes. And so, so when the masks come off their faces, it is I that's bleeding, I that's hurting. I'll wrap up this discussion, because we do need to wrap up Zoom sessions. The conversations should go on in real time, in real life. I'll wrap it up by saying that the answer to this problem might not lie in banning or boycotting or canceling their works altogether, because that might be somewhat fascist. But we need to be mindful of the fact that if we are going to be talking to our students about Walcott, if we are going to be writing dissertations on Walcott, if we are going to be reading Walcott, we will also have to remind ourselves that the writer could potentially be a rapist, a molester, a pedophile, an abuser, outside of that work and inside of that work, that the writer could potentially be a monster, and that this writer's voice is not the voice of God, no matter how hard or how passionately we worship it, we want to believe it. What should I say in conclusion? You will find many people defending the works of Derek Walcott, the works of Pablo Neruda, the works of Naipaul, the works of all these men that I'm not naming right now, but lists are available. And lists are not exhaustive, because you should know that there are names that are not on those lists and that are getting away with this kind of behavior as well. So you will find a lot of people that are defending Derek Walcott. That was not my intention, that was not my purpose. My purpose was to dirty him up, was to problematize this idea of worship. Um, you will find these critics, these writers, these other readers defending him, and that, I mean, that is why he is a star. That is why he is Derek Walcott. But my prayer to you as readers would be to also believe women when they come out with their stories, with their testimonies. It's otherwise a disservice to their trauma and to the courage that they're showing in sharing this trauma with the world. It's never too late to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for sharing your insights. Without further delay, let's move on to the next session. The poet of the Caribbean, the poet of the twilight, Derek Walcott had volumes to speak to us. Throughout a long and distinguished career, he returned to those same themes of language, power, and place. Now we have with us Dr. Rafael Di Abden. Dr. Rafael Di Abden is a writer, scholar, spoken word poet, editor, and translator. He holds an MA in Arts from the University of Uppsala, Sweden, and a PhD in Linguistics and Literary Studies from the University of Udine, Italy. He has lectured at the Department of English Studies at the University of South Africa and at the Contemporary South Africa and at the Mansi Poetry Academy. In 2007, he compiled, translated, and edited an anthology of contemporary South African poetry. In 2011, he translated into Italian with Lorenzo Mari the autobiography of a South African poet, Mario Di Uffizi. In 2013, he compiled and edited the collection, Marikana, A Moment in Time, and was one of the featured poets at the Poetry Africa Festival in Durban. He's the author of 3 collections of poems, Sunnyside Night Walk, Salt Water, and The Bitter Herb. And he has read his poetry in South Africa, Nigeria, Somaliland, Italy, and the USA, where he chaired a session on spoken word and literature at the 2011 Chinua Achebe Colloquium. His poems have been published in journals, magazines, and anthologies in South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Malawi, Singapore, Palestine, India, Italy, USA, and the UK. He's South Africa's representative of Africa Haiku Network, and he's a member of the South African Poetry Project and International Poetry Project, 2 joint projects at the University of Cambridge, UNISA, and the University of the Witwatersrand, whose chief aims are to promote poetry in schools in South Africa, UK, and beyond, and to instill knowledge, understanding, and a love of poetry in young learners. Sir, we are fortunate to have you with us to read your poem, Middlesea Blues, published in a special edition of Muse India, dedicated to Walcott, and to share your personal engagement with Walcott's words.
Thank you everyone for this invitation. I'm truly honored to be here today to speak to you about this poet in particular. And thanks a lot also to my friend Somrita for her provoking introduction and much needed introduction, because I think that some of the things that she raised we've been all struggling with for a long time. So I'm sure we'll be able to engage with her later after my short contribution to this debate. And yes, thank you for inviting me not only to read this poem that I'm going to read soon, but also to talk about my own personal engagement with Ngugi. And I will not be too long, but I was reflecting on what my engagement with Walcott is, and I thought that if you are serious or at least curious about literature, in your journey of discovery, you will often bump into Derek Walcott, so to speak. Sorry, for lack of a better term. And this happens because he's a poet. As a poet, he was so versatile, so encyclopedic, so visionary, that eventually you find his work at the crossroads of multiple literary worlds. I'm sure you had this experience when you encountered this writer. So personally, for instance, I make you an example. I'm teaching right now Arthur Miller and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And interestingly, but not really surprisingly, because great writers are always in conversation with each other, they are both strongly connected to Walcott. You might know that Miller was his very good friend, and the novel that I'm teaching by Ngugi, Petals of Blood, is actually titled after an image that appears in Walcott's poem, The Swamp. So the title of the book is taken by a poem by Walcott. And so there are these and many other connections that I could mention here, and they show how Walcott's work is actually timeless in my view, for the reason that its language is rooted in the mythological languages of the human experience. And he was a man of many homes and many worlds, and a poet of many homes and many worlds. And so I think that the poem that I'm going to read to you today somehow reflects or mirrors Walcott's worldview, this multipolar worldview that he had. So just a little bit of background, and then I'll read the poem. In 2017, I was invited to do a reading at a conference in Naples, in Italy, and the conference focus was the Black Mediterranean, the exodus of Africans who tried to access the fortress Europe by crossing the Mediterranean Sea. And with the invitation came the notification that I was going to share the podium at the conference with Zineb Sedira. Zineb Sedira is an Algerian visual artist whose work I deeply admire. And for the occasion, I wrote a poem inspired by one of her video installations titled Middlesea, which explores what Walcott himself calls the Middle Passage. And I titled the poem Middlesea Blues. A couple of weeks later, I was reading at another conference in Italy, and this time I was sharing the podium with the Indian poet Jaydeep Sarangi. So we did our reading, and at the end of the reading, Jaydeep told me that he was guest editing a special issue of an Indian journal, Muse India, dedicated to Walcott, and he asked me if I had a poem to send him. I said, yes, I might have one, and I sent him Middlesea Blues, and it was accepted. So when I received the good news that the poem was going to be published, I thought about this poem journey, and I realized that it is a poem inspired by an Algerian artist living in France, written in English by an Italian living in South Africa, and published in an Indian journal dedicated to a Caribbean writer. So it reminded me that poetry transcends boundaries. And so this poem that I'm going to read now, it's a poem that inhabits, many landscapes, and it's my little tribute to this poet who himself inhabited many landscapes. Middlesea Blues. Ghost-like, we sneak into the underground corridors of your safe existence, eager to catch bits of sun with our broken fishnets. Lighthouses illuminate the transparent walls of our life stories, as the wind steals our memories and abandons them on the waterfronts that left us the day we left them. The seagulls and the waves on whose wings we travel vanish behind clouds in the twilight breeze like drumbeats do. We've been crossing seas, deserts, and borders, like our ancestors did, like our children will do. We keep on moving towards the unknown. Middle seas have been swallowing us, and in their belly, we have learned how to sing the blues. We are still here today to sing it back to you. And when it is too hard to sing it, we hide it inside a smile. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raphael, sir. Ma'am, are you here? We have a few questions. Probably we'll take a few questions before we move on to the next speaker.
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. So there's a question from Rani PL.
Sorry.
Do you think exposure of body or contours consciously to attract attention on them by women encourage colonization of their bodies, not to redeem the colonizer of the skewed perception he has from an Indian perspective?
Okay, can I just read this question as well? I'm going to open up my chat box.
Sure.
So, do you think exposure of the body contours consciously to attract attention on them? Encourage. This is, I mean, I'm laughing by, I don't, you know, this is not to sort of say this question is unimportant at all. I mean, I could answer it in two ways. I could answer it by talking to you about theory, and in that case, I would talk about this fascinating book which Ranajit Guha has written, Dominance Without Hegemony. Hegemony is when you colonize or rule over people with their permission, and you know that is what the colonizer said, that this is, you know, this is what we are doing, this is our project, we have the permission to do this, we have the permission to sort of enslave the body of the black man and the black woman and the brown man and the brown woman, and then they would sanctify, sort of justify, legitimize that act by sort of passing it on to God, etc. So there's that whole story, by passing it on to God, by passing it on to like superior culture, etc. There's that whole story. And then Ranajit Guha comes up with this book and this theory, Dominance Without Hegemony. And he asks, so when you were colonizing India, did you actually come and seek our permission? Did you ask us, can we do this to you? And then did we say, yes, you can? And so you did it. So dominance without hegemony. So yeah, that's sort of like, if I think if you would be interested in sort of like a theoretical position on how bodies are enslaved, I think that would be a good starting point. Of course, there's so much written on the idea of body and enslaving the body and embodiment theory. But what is like my everyday answer to you, you know, an answer which is not reeking of like academic, you know, academic supremacy, whatever you want to call it. Let me read out that question for you again, so all of us can participate in this. Do you think exposure of the body or contours consciously to attract attention on them by women encourage colonization? You know, it's going back to that story of, did she ask to be raped? And the answer for me is no. Even if she was showing her body, even if she was standing naked on the road, even if she were lying naked on your bed and she changes her mind last minute and says no, it doesn't give you the permission. And even if she doesn't have the voice to say a no, because that is where we talk about power structures. There are times when you cannot say a no to your PhD advisor because that PhD is at stake. You cannot say a no to your boss because that job is at stake. There are times you cannot say, when you cannot articulate that no. And there are times when children can't articulate a no. They don't know what is happening to them. They don't know what is being done to their bodies. Yeah, I mean, my one word answer is no. Even if I'm showing my body and inviting, as you would say, attention on it, trying to attract attention towards it, seeking to be colonized, it doesn't give you the permission to colonize that body. As a human being, you do not have the right to colonize another human being, animal, or plant life. I'm going to say something even more controversial at this point in time, but I thought I started out, I started out on that note. So, you know, how much more can I offend you today? But you know what the book of Genesis says, God made man in his own image and then gave him dominion over fish and fowl and all other life around me. What if I say man made God in his own image to legitimize, to justify the dominion that he for himself had usurped over other men, women, animal, plant life, right? So yeah, I mean, that is my position on it. And then if I can see another
we have a second question.
Yes.
It is true that the writers you mentioned have used their positions of power in order to abuse those that are powerless to protest. Why don't we take the poet Walcott as any other human being that is prone to faults? Why should the artist or the poet be an angel?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is also, I mean, I'm really glad you brought it up, because that is sort of what I was proposing towards the end of my talk, that, you know, if we look at, if we stop looking at this artist as extraordinarily gifted, I mean, obviously gifted in the craft, but extraordinarily morally gifted, so to speak, again, morally within quotes. If we stop doing that, if we start looking at the artist as another human being with follies and foibles and flaws, essentially flawed, essentially monstrous, the word that I was using, the sense of betrayal that you go through is, I think, less intense. It's easier to reconcile these two images of the artist that is, you know, creating painfully, positively beautiful, brilliant art, but also someone that's going and raping a subaltern woman or molesting a student, and sort of misusing this position of power. Yeah, I think that that sense of betrayal is less intense. So, I mean, so if your question is why aren't we doing that? I think, I mean, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do as well. But having said that, why, I can tell you why I find it problematic. Maybe you won't, and maybe some of us won't, but why I find it problematic, because, you know, because of what I think of art. And therefore, you know, there's sort of this direct link between what I think of art and therefore what I think of the artist. And if art is supposed to be that realm of truth with a capital T, then the artist is supposed to, if the artist is supposed to handhold me to that position of truth with a capital T, then it becomes difficult to picture this artist as a molester, as a rapist, right? And having said that, does it excuse, if we, let's say we assume this artist to be like an ordinary human being with faults and fallacies, of course, which is what I'm sort of suggesting we can try and do as a way forward, does it excuse this ordinary human being also of this kind of behavior, right? I mean, isn't that why we have, or why we have had feminist movements down the ages, starting from when it started and how it has evolved from when it started? Isn't that why we have the Me Too movement? Isn't that why we are trying to call out people? Because no, you shouldn't be doing, no, you shouldn't be raping someone as an ordinary human being, but also no, as a person in a position of power in society, it is, I think that responsibility is, it just goes up, the stakes are higher. How can you, I mean, you know, but yeah, like I said, I don't think there is an easy answer to this. And the only way in which we can find solutions, if at all there are solutions, is to keep talking about it, which is basically what I'm trying to say, that when you talk about Walcott, talk about his poetry, talk about his language, talk about his art, but also don't forget to acknowledge this person that the artist was. Don't separate the person from the persona. Okay, I'm just going to see if there is anything else.
And we have one more question. Please do not take me for a male chauvinist. There is a disclaimer. I am not, but if we are going to consider the oeuvre of an artist only if his life is as pure as the art he creates, would we be able to admire any art he creates at all. I'm not saying Walcott or Neruda or anyone else should be exonerated from the excesses they committed, but separate their art from the persons they were or are.
Again, you know, I mean, no, I don't think of you as a chauvinist at all. And this is because as Rafael was saying earlier, and as I said, I mean, there is no easy answer, right? If there were an easy answer, we wouldn't be talking about it for so long. Can we do this? Will we ever be able to admire art if we keep bringing the life into it, if we keep bringing biographical details into it? You know, I'm tempted to say yes. I'm tempted to say yes, because for like one Derek Walcott that I have mentioned, I can mention a Toni Morrison. For one Pablo Neruda that I have mentioned, I can mention a Chimamanda or a Maya Angelou or an Alice Walker. I mean, what I'm saying is there are artists that aren't molesters, that aren't rapists, and you can still read their art by talking about their life. And then there are artists that are molesters and rapists. So I think it is a bit of a disservice to even their work, to even their poetic output, if we don't sort of, if we don't talk about the person. But like I said, there are people who can draw that line of demarcation, art for art's sake, separate the art from the artist. I, unfortunately for you today, am not one of those people. I cannot do that. And I look at them, as a whole, instead of just sort of, you know, reading the art in vacuum.
Thank you, ma'am.
But that's my position.
Coming on to Raphael, sir. Sir, if I may ask you, where is Caribbean the intersection point of Middlesea and your Middlesea Blues and Derek Walcott? If you can reflect, that would be nice.
Yes, Middlesea obviously is an image of a crossroad, of something, also of a ritual of passage that you have to go through in order to survive. And that's why I reminded the story of that poem, because you know, it took me also to places that I did not plan to go to at the beginning. So I find myself, as it often happens to me when I engage with poetry writing, I find myself in places that I didn't even imagine when I started. And so this image of the Middle Blues became central. Sorry, of the Middle Sea became central after, you know, I started to look at the work by that Algerian artist Zineb Sedira from a poetic perspective. And when I wrote that poem, I also had in mind the words of Jane Cortez, who so beautifully spoke about the blues as this language that comes from the bottom of the ocean, you know, as part of the history of slavery and migration. And, you know, and again, I was invited to reflect on what is happening today in the two continents that actually I inhabited as a person, because I'm a European living in Africa, and every day there is this massive exodus of African people dying, you know, literally being swallowed, as I say in my poem, by the Mediterranean Sea, in the you know, indifference of most European countries that actually actively contribute to this contemporary slave trade that is happening in the Mediterranean Sea. And so there were all these different influences and thoughts that you know, came up when I, you know, started to engage with this story of people trying to cross a middle sea, you know. And as I say, it's a ritual, and you never know what is expecting you on the other side of the journey when you start it. You know, when you go through this ritual, these passages, these rites. And so you know, eventually I find myself and this poem in a common space with Walcott's poetry. And it was surprising at the beginning, but as I was trying to say before, not so much, because, you know, writers speak to each other. And the reason why I always return to Walcott is that I am myself a diasporic person. And so there's always something I can find in his writing that resonates to me. You know, and that said, there's something that also, you know, I would like to say in relation to what Somrita said, and I fully agree with all she said. The only thing I don't agree with is this idea of not punishing abusers and violators and rapists and so on. I don't think it's fascist. I think it's right to punish someone that has been, you know, recognized as a rapist, as an abuser, etc. So in my view, one of the things that we could do, obviously talk about that, but also hit them where it hurts, in their pocket, because part of the power that these people have come through their position in university, come from their invitation to festivals, come from their endorsement that they have by publishing houses. So my point of view is, if all these people, if the only good thing that these people can give to the world is their work, their art, so let's engage with the art, but let's also isolate the artist. You know, let's not celebrate the artist. Let's celebrate the art. Let's read their books, you know, and I think that could be a wake-up call for many of them, if they started to be punished, you know, and not celebrated as public figures, as they are in many cases. So, you know, that's I will always continue to read Walcott's work, because it's an important source for me as a writer. But we have to keep in mind, I think, what these people also stand for as public figures, and we can't ignore that. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you all. Now we have with us Dr. Arunlal, who is an assistant professor in the Department of English, Government College, Mokeri, a certified resource person at UGC HRDC Kerala University and UGC HRDC Kannur University. Dr. Arunlal acts in the capacity of IQAC coordinator at Government College, Mokeri. He is also an author, poet, translator, director of eProf CDC, and an academic counselor at Indira Gandhi National Open University. He completed PhD in English Literature from English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad in 2012. He has translated screenplays of Malayalam films to English for International Shakespearean Studies Desk, headed by Professor Mark Taunton. He has translated to Malayalam the philosophical writings of Russell under the title Manushyanum Yukti Chindayum. He has several published articles and translations to his credit: philosophical writings of Bertrand Russell, obscenity and popular culture, post-colonial fiction, readers' desire for truth are among his major works. Dr. Arunlal shall lay open Walcott and new Edens of world poetry to us. So may I welcome you, sir? Over to you, sir.
Most of the Walcott sessions that we have, discussions regarding Derek Walcott, usually they begin with the apprehensions that Somrita had put forth. Should we discuss this person as a great poet, because his reputation has been besmirched blackened by allegations of abuse that has come up from his own graduate students. And yeah, of course, I mean, she was also right to combine him and team him up with a list of abusers come great poets that we have seen in the past. But now that we have discussed it, I think I can put the discussion behind and go on to another vista of Walcott's craft, art, as I would have it. In a way, when we look at a poet and his work, we're also looking at how this poet is trying to engage with a whole lot of works that had come in the past. Like, as far as Walcott is concerned, he is almost at the beginning of a tradition. It is not like he had predecessors writing from St. Luciana. It's not like he had Caribbean predecessors from which he can draw inspiration from. single-handedly he was trying to found a tradition. Much like V.S. Naipaul, you would again find, people from Caribbean, I mean, these late authors from Caribbean islands. Maybe there was a literature of the natives earlier. Maybe there is a whole lot of oral literature that has gone undocumented. But for the contemporary reader, for the 21st century reader, for the sensitive aesthetic of aesthetician of aesthete of 21st century, Walcott belongs to that category of artists who did not take a tradition forward, but in fact founded it. Now that is an interesting point. That is perhaps something that we need to, I mean, I'm not discussing him as a person in that sense. Of course, as a person, of course, as you have seen, he has been continuing a tradition of molestation, a tradition of abuse of power. Well, that tradition is there. I'm talking about another kind of tradition. I'm talking about how poets establish an aesthetic tradition, and how Walcott was not taking hints from a tradition that had already been put in place. He was founding a tradition. He was founding a certain aesthetics. And there are some additional dimensions, therefore, when we study Walcott, when we look at Walcott, when we read Walcott, when we read poems like Far Cry from South Africa, or Ruins of a Great House, classic Walcott poems, when we read them, we need to understand that we are approaching a poem, or we are approaching a poetic corpus that sought to talk to a larger community outside St. Louisiana, because he's using English as his medium of communication, because he's writing poems in English. He was very particular that his English has to mimic and at the same time overpower the kind of English that has been used by the modernist and the movement poets, the postmodernists who came after that. The English that was used in those poetic traditions, language which has been spread. I mean, English as a language has been taken to colonies, and all those colonies have imbibed something of the English tradition in their academia. I mean, look at Walcott himself. He was taught English in school, and that is why he took a fascination to this language. And he was a great scholar of Renaissance literature. And he in Ruins of a Great House, you would find him dedicating his poem to Thomas Browne, for that matter. So you would find that this person was interested in the history of English language and literature, like many of us graduates, many of us in India who graduates in English literature with a fascination towards Shakespeare, with a fascination towards Keats. Like Somrita had categorized herself as somebody who's speaking English, somebody who writes in English, somebody who was an English academician from India. So this divided, this divided loyalties that we have as people who deal with literature, as people who discuss literature, this is where people like Walcott actually come as very important points of departure. They condition our aesthetics to look at the world in a totally different way. Here you have somebody like us, somebody who has been taught English, somebody who has used English, somebody whose thought about the world had been conditioned by this language, English, and its tradition of a certain kind of aesthetics. And then he uses that tradition. He uses it back on the empire. But very famously, Walcott doesn't use it with a vengeance. He is very unlike Ngugi. He is very unlike Chinua Achebe and any other black writers that we would talk about. We would think about when we think about like writing back to the empire, writing the empire being written back, and all those post-colonial authors that we group together. We will find that people like Neruda, people like Whitman, for instance. One fascinating thing about Walcott is, like, if you check out his essay, he comes up with this very interesting essay in 1974, The Muses of History, The Muse of History, 1974. He gives you a category of poets, a tradition of poets, a descent of poets, a genealogy of poets, in whose line he wants to locate himself. And that begins not very early, even though he is an admirer of Renaissance poets, even though he has a fascination for Renaissance English literature, he does not begin his line of poets. He does not begin his descent from them. He begins with Whitman. He identifies himself as somebody who takes the tradition forward, a tradition inaugurated by Whitman, and something that has evolved through poets like Octavio Paz and Neruda, and then come to him. There is a way in which he looks at the world anew uh, through his vocation as a poet, through his calling as a poet. His poetic craft is supposed to look at world as an Eden, a possibility, a possibility. He's trying to inscribe the world, a world that has not been written about, a world that has not been, seriously taken, seriously considered, a world whose representations has not appeared on the literary cartography before him. He's taking it up and then he's trying to make sense of this whole idea. The essay actually says how it is, the essay actually puts life ahead of literature. And, Walcott, I'm quoting from that essay, we may not even need literature, not that we are beyond it, but in the archipelago particularly, nature, the elements, if you want, are so new, so overpowering in their presence that awe is deeper than articulation of awe. Now, this comes from Walcott. Walcott actually considers it unnecessary to even have literature in a place like St. Louisiana, because the nature, the elements that make up the life in St. Louisiana, they inspire an awe, and this awe is larger than, greater than, more impactful than the articulation of it. And he continues to say, he says, memory is less than the place which it cherishes. The place that cherishes, the place that evokes a memory, the place that creates a memory is greater than the memory itself. The island that triggers the tradition that that he inaugurates is higher than, better than itself. There is a way in which he idolifies, he kind of mystifies, he idolates this island and its geography, its cartography, its aesthetics, its way of looking at life. He deifies it. There is a way in which this place is an Eden for him. It's like the newfound land for him. Like the colonizer goes to a land, names it after them, makes a cartography of the place after their logics and their convenience. In the same manner, the poet also visits a land and then names it, cartographizes it, divides it, gives it a history, gives it a mythology, like he would do with Omeros, for instance. Omeros is like a retelling of Iliad, but then retelling of Iliad in a very contemporary manner. This Iliad needs to be retold because Iliad was appropriated by the European civilization. And then you have to see it from the eyes of somebody who's not a European. Perhaps it is not a retelling, it is a rediscovery. It is perhaps an unraveling of other possibilities that you had in Iliad. That is what Walcott did when he rewrote, when he retold, Iliad as Homeros. So what I'm trying to say is giving mythology to a place, giving a foundational story to a place, giving it its imaginative existence. And that's a huge responsibility. It's like, there is a garden in which two people lived, and then there was this tree of forbidden fruit. Now, calling it Eden, associating it with the curse, associating it with the original sin, that is where the mythology lies. That is where ideologies spring from. That is where you see, how Satan could tempt Eve. It's a mythological point as well as an ideological point. It's a political point, if you want. So in the same manner, when you think of St. Louisiana or the Caribbean islands as a new Eden where these possibilities could be planted, and then you have this poet who takes it as his sole responsibility, his life responsibility to place all those imaginary reference points in the real cartography of St. Louisiana. This is what makes it interesting. This is what makes Walcott's career so interesting. If you look at that essay that I was trying to refer to, he insists in the beginning that colonialism is the common experience of the new world and NW capital. So when he looks at the world as a new place, you know, it is not like he is repudiating history. It is not like he is trying to, suppress or push under the carpet this entire log of history, entire log of suffering, entire log of exploitation of these Caribbean islands from the hands of the colonizing European nations. No, he is not doing that. But then he tries to find a commonality that connects the new world, suffering, colonialism. He says colonialism is the common experience of the new world, and that American lectures can roughly be divided between those who, in response to this history, now this is important. He says it is given, it is agreed that you have a colonial past. But how do you respond to the colonial past? There are two kinds of responses possible, or there are at least two traditions of responses possible. There has been two traditions. There has been in effect at least two major branches of poets, two major kinds of poets who responded to colonialism, alias the commonality, the common denominator that connects all the nations of all the places of all the histories of New World. Well, one is a literature of recrimination and despair. So you can think of a set of poets who respond to post-colonialism politically, who post-colonialism in the sense to colonialism politically. Colonialism is held as the most criminal move in human history, the most violent move in human history, the move in human history that has taken the maximum toll of human lives. So you can recriminate and produce a literature of despair out of it. This is one choice, and Walcott is not repudiating it. Walcott is not trying to say that this is wrong. Walcott basically says that this is one kind of response, and this response is valid, but perhaps there is another kind of response, and this response is where he identifies himself with. He does not recriminate the history of colonialism. He, like Conrad would say in the beginning of Heart of Darkness, that this was also a place of darkness, and thereby linking the history of Britain with the history of colonized nations. In the same manner, Walcott also tries to put this in a much broader canvas. He tries to make it he's not trying to foreground colonial experience. He is trying to zoom out from the colonial experience. Now, this zooming out will entail the second kind of response to colonialism. And he says, this is, I'm reading out from the essay again, I quote, the American letters. Now, American here, it's not about USA, it's about this continent. He's talking about the new world, including Latin America. He always had a problem with this terminology, Latin America. He thought that was just a fluke, that that kind of a taxonomy basically held its place. He wanted the Caribbean islands to basically club together with the Latin American literary tradition. Well, that is another point to discuss. We will come to that in a minute. Let us get back to this quote where he says, the American letters can roughly be divided between those who, in response to this history, produce a literature of recrimination and despair, and those great poets of the New World, from Whitman to Neruda. Now, you see, my interest was in this particular line of thought. It is possible for us to find n number of politically correct writers who put post-colonialism as a project that is bent on, that is meant to recriminate and produce a literature of despair on suffering. Like, look back into your past, you've been exploited, you've been made to suffer pain, you've been made to suffer, you've been made to lose your self-respect, and then feel the loss of self-respect. You've been religiously exploited, you've been economically exploited, you've been politically exploited, you've been culturally exploited. Now this whole baggage of exploitation should basically trigger a political response from you, and poets are duty bound to take it up. Now this is like social realism. This is like socialist realist literature. So there is this whole branch of post-colonial poets who are legitimate, definitely, in their angst, in their anger. They are absolutely legitimate, and they go forward with this the articulation of this anger. But then he chooses to show us this set of the great authors, the great poets, according to Walcott, the tradition that he wants to identify with, the tradition that he would put himself in. And remember what I was trying to refer in the beginning of this session. He is technically not part of any tradition. He is the first major poet of the islands. And then he has single-handedly found the tradition. He single-handedly takes this tradition forward. But in his imagination, but in his theory, he would actually go back and connect to this tradition of great poets of the New World, from Whitman to Neruda. And how does he categorize them? How does he mark them? He says, whose vision of man is Adamic, or praise of earth is ancestral. This is interesting, the way he tries to look at it. This is zooming out from the politics altogether, but then not forgetting that this politics is integral to his making. This is the same with Whitman. Like, Whitman is zooming out from particulars, but at the same time, it is in Whitman that we find, the articulations of technology, the articulation of gay life, the articulation of street life. Everything we find, very prominently articulated in Whitman. In Neruda also, you will find the same. Neruda, Whitman, Paz, this entire cluster of writers that Walcott is trying to refer to, they have been creating a certain tradition of the new world, of the new promises, of the new world, of the new promises, of the new Eden. The suffering that colonialism, the colonized nations had undergone, that suffering, according to Walcott, enables them to develop a new vision regarding the world itself. And this vision is what is important, because this vision is unique. And for him, this vision is Adamic, A-D-A-M-I-C, A capital Adamic. Like Adam looked at the world. It is that's how we look at the world. In his case, definitely it is absolutely clear why he makes such a statement. Because for him, he is the Adam. He is the first person who writes from that island. In English, he is the first person who tries to establish a chain of communication with the outer world, with the world that speaks English, with the world of poetry readers who speak English, who read English, us for that matter, people in other colonized regions, people in colonizing regions. He's trying to have a communication with them. He's trying to establish a poetic communication with them. He's trying to establish an aesthetic. He's trying to establish a certain a tradition, like Adam would establish a tradition. So this is Adamic for him. And the praise of the earth is ancestral. And remember how he later would say that St. Luciana needed no literature because the place was more than literature. And he says how memory is always less than the place it cherishes. So, the way Walcott's imagination works, the way Walcott's poetic output has tried to look at the world and the traditions of literature that had gone into it, how it works, I think we need to be particularly aware of how this Adamic imagination, it attends to it attends to this ancestral praise. It attends to this aesthetic of new places, like renewing an epic. Why would Walcott or any poet bother to renew an epic? It is not a retelling. Okay, it is not like somebody takes up a piece from Ramayana, an episode from Ramayana, and then tries to give a new color to it. That is not how Omeros works. Omeros is complicated. And you may also remember the fascination that Walcott held stylistically to the conventional poetic forms in English language. He was an ardent scholar of Renaissance literature. I said he was somebody who could handle almost all patterns of poetry, forms of poetry that existed in English poetic oeuvre. Like, he could write a ballad, he could write a sonnet, he could use the rhymes and meters, like the rhythm that he used was especially, the cadence that he used was very clearly English in its tone. It did not use a pidgin or Creole kind of a tongue in it. You would find very rarely does Walcott use pidgin language. I haven't found them using pidgin languages in any of his major poems. I don't know if there are some exceptions that you had spotted, but none of his major poems use pidgin for expression or Creole for expression. He uses English as English is used by the native speakers of English, and he thinks in cadences which are native to English poetry. And his choice of words, his distribution of words, his selection of forms, it is very difficult for us to think of this poet as somebody who is not English in essence. He uses English, in other words, like, the form that he uses is strictly, maybe you should connect him with Dylan Thomas for that matter. In very many ways. Dylan Thomas also was a molester. Dylan Thomas also was a drunkard. Dylan Thomas also was somebody who was absolutely socially repugnant, somebody who's a poetic figure, was drawn into like n number of controversies, but then somebody who evolved to establish, to found a vision that was Edenic, that was ancestral, that was religious, that and then he came from Wales, but he did not write in Welsh. He used the cadences of English poetry. He revolutionized English poetry by bringing in his Welsh self into it. He looked at the world as an Eden. I'm talking about Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas looked at the world as an Eden, and he used English as his medium, though he was a Welshman and he did not write in Welsh. Or maybe you could think about Joyce. It is of interest that Walcott himself connects his art to the art of art taken up by James Joyce. It is very striking, in fact, that Walcott, he did I have the quote here. He talks of a transnational new world of poetic opportunity. Transnational new world of poetic opportunity. So this is his vision. Beyond nations, beyond the history of colonialism, there has come up a new world of promises, of possibilities, and it is up to the poets, up to these poets, up to this branch of poets, this new breed of poets, starting from Whitman, this Adamic poets, this ancestral praise of earth band of poets, they are supposed to take this forward. And in addition to Whitman and Pablo Neruda, he invokes other allies, like he takes up Aimé Césaire, he takes up Saint John Peirce, he takes up Borges, he takes up Dennis Williams, he takes up Wilson Harris, and he is even lenient enough to add Ted Hughes in it, James Joyce in it, Samuel Beckett in it, and in certain other essays he has included Octavio Paz, Alejo Carpentier, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Cesar Vallejo, Carlos Fuentes. The only logic to his literary history is the poet's attempt to describe an ancient human existential task of making the world, which is to say, this is not a literary history, but a poetics. Well, that is my point. He's not trying to give us a sort of literary history. He picks up people. It's not random picking up of people. He's very conscious when he picks up people. When he talks of Whitman, and then when he says that, okay, Octavio Paz and Cesar Vallejo and James Joyce could be put together in this class, he is trying to talk about poetics here. He's trying to talk about a certain aesthetics here. It's not basically giving us a literary history. It's not merely traditional in that sense. It's not mechanically traditional in that sense. Again, I'm not suggesting that this could be taken for face value. Just because Walcott says that it is possible to think about the world in this particular fashion, we should not take it on face value. You can have contentions to it. The major contention being he does not ever include any female poet in this grand history that he talks about, this grand event, this grand revelation that he talks about. He never includes a single female poet for the matter. I mean, when he talks about he doesn't talk about Emily Dickinson. When you talk about Walt Whitman, usually we do include in discussions of Walt Whitman and the kind of poetry that Walt Whitman pioneered. We also talk about how Emily Dickinson gives you the other side of Walt Whitman's kind of poetry. But Walcott conveniently forgets that. Okay, he chooses the tradition from Whitman to Neruda, but he doesn't include poets like Emily Dickinson, poets like Gabriela Mistral for that matter, and Elizabeth Bishop, these poets are conspicuously absent from his concept of tradition. And as Eliot has successfully problematized in 1920s, tradition is something that we discover. Tradition is not something that is ready-made given to us. Like you question the tradition, you challenge the tradition, or you put the tradition in place, you put a certain tradition in place. So, I think Walcott was aware of it, aware of this dimension. He was not writing poetry as an individual. He was writing poetry as part of a tradition that he very consciously constructed and put in place. And this tradition is instrumental in making Walcott's poetry relevant to us. And I think he deserves a Nobel Prize because of this larger project that he undertook. And this larger project that has gone unobserved or undocumented in our literature or any literature for that matter. I haven't seen people looking closely at this project that Walcott was very interested in. So I take the opportunity of this seminar, this webinar, to put in front of you this particular task that Walcott was cashing on, this ability to create tradition, this tendency, this need that he felt to create a tradition and disseminate it, the way he placed certain people in it, and how he brought his figure as a pioneer, as an establisher of a tradition, into he seamlessly blends that pioneer figure into this tradition, into this particular block of poets that he picks up from the history of world immediately after colonialism or at the brink of the end of colonialism. He picks up European authors, he picks up New American authors, he picks up post-colonial authors like Aimé Césaire, for instance. He picks up Black authors, and then he constructs a tradition. And all over his writings, his pop prose writings, his interviews, you would find him giving scattered references to this particular tradition and very consciously trying to place himself as somebody whose work needs to be understood in the light of this tradition, in the light of the tradition of the new world, the new Eden, as the Adamic poetry that he talks about, the Adamic or the Eden poetry that he talks about. And well, that is my argument. That is just one thing that I wanted to put up in this platform. Other aspects to Walcott's poetry, his aesthetics, his dimensions of understanding, his understanding his divided self. These things have been commented upon. So, Somrita in the beginning session has told how he is an apt representative of divided loyalties. Somebody who needs to write in English, but somebody who's a Black person, somebody who's from an island, but then has become a part of European poetic cult. So these things have been talked about. These things are usually talked about, as far as Walcott is concerned. Something that we do not generally discuss is this idea of N capital new W capital word, new word that he was thinking about. His conception of himself as being part of this cluster of poets, this new world, Edenic, Adamic poets, Walt Whitman to Neruda, and then his vision as contributing to it. Well, this is it. This is what I was trying to. This is what I wanted to share with you. This is what I wanted to table in this webinar. If you have some questions, I can take those questions now. Over to the coordinators.
Thank you very much, sir. Before we come to you, I would like to make a question to Raphael, sir, again. This was a question that was sent to us prior to the session. I suppose the person who had sent in the question was known to the fact that you are also a spoken word poet. So the question is, it is generally said about South African English poetry that there is a lot of rhythm or word music in them compared to, say, Indian English poetry. So what is your reflection on that? This is a general question that has come up.
Well, it's a huge question. I mean, I'm not sure if I have enough knowledge of Indian poetry to be able to compare these two traditions and languages. But what I can observe is what they have in common, which is a multilingual, substratum, a multilingual background. They both these cultures refer to. So obviously, my field is South African poetry, and the English that comes out of this tradition is an English that, again, learning from Walcott's lesson, is an English that has absorbed the landscape of South Africa and all its languages. But I suppose, and I'm sure you can answer this question better than me, but I suppose it's exactly the same in Indian poetry. And as far as I know, it is. So I don't think South African is more, if I understood the question well, it's basically asking if South African English is more like musical than Indian English because of its the influence of its indigenous languages. I don't know if I understood the question well, but
it was particularly to South African English poetry.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, as I say, it depends. Also, there are many South African English poetry, different poetry written in English in South Africa. You have the more modernist, Western-oriented poetry written by a certain sector of the South African poetry community. Then you have the vernacular. You have the so-called performance poetry that sometimes, mimics rap and hip hop. So it's not a straightforward answer that's not a straightforward answer that I can give to you. There are many Englishes inside South African poetry, and that's the beauty of it for me. That's really the beauty of it. And more often than not, South African poetry is also translingual and multilingual. A lot of poetry is multilingual. So certainly there is a reference also to the canonical British tradition in some cases, but the language that South African poets have developed through their story, it's definitely something unique that reflects the local landscape, culture, history, and the lesson of Walcott in this sense is very important. So I don't know if I answered the question, but
okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. One last question to you. We got to understand that you teach in South Africa, and you are a European. You have said that, and then you also said that you teach Walcott over there. So how is it? How is that experience? We are very curious to know. What is the response that you get from students when you, as a European, teach African students Derek Walcott? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it depends who is my audience. Obviously, in a more academic environment, people are aware of who Walcott is and what he has done. But then I also work a lot with young poets who most of the times don't have a literary background and they have no idea who Walcott is. So what I try to do, I try to explain to them the importance of Walcott in the history of poetry. How, and here I connect with what Aruna said before, how Walcott is a child of actually different traditions, and if we look at the epic traditions, you have the ancient epic traditions, and here we're talking about the oral literatures of all the indigenous people around the world, and they had their own epic stories. But then we also have what I call the most modern epic tradition, and I'm thinking about poets like Homer or like Dante in Italy. And Arunlal mentioned Whitman in America, and I would maybe add adds rapound to it. Those poets who were able to take these traditions, the ancient epic tradition and the modern tradition, and combine them and write their own epic. So Walcott is peculiar, is special for me in that sense, because he's that kind of poet that was able to create the epic not only of the Caribbeans, but of all diasporic people around the world. And that's why someone like me can connect to his poetry. And so that's what I teach, why I teach Walcott to my youngest students. I want them to understand how important it is to engage with the tradition if you want to find your own voice. And sometimes, as you know, the poetry of Walcott can be quite obscure, and that is off-putting for some of the youngest poets. But once they realize his trajectory, what his trajectory was, and you know what you should do as a poet if you want to create your own language and find your own voice, then they start to appreciate him as a writer. And that's why I regularly use his work.
Okay, I'm sorry, there's one more question from Chandramohan sir himself. He asks, can you compare Derek Walcott and Camoa Brathwaite briefly?
Still to me?
Yes. This is a question from Mr. Chandramohan himself.
As I say, I mean, I don't know what to. I have no interesting things to say about it. But as I said, I mean, they are definitely the voices of their time and their place, and that's why they occupy such a central position in any for anyone who's interested in poetry. So these are questions that require quite a lot of marination, and there are certainly similarities and differences among between these authors, but I think that intertextually poets are always somehow connected with each other, and I think the same happens with Walcott and Braithwaite, but yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. Coming back to Arunlal, sir. So I think you could take Vinod's question where he asked, what is the evolution of Walcott's craftsmanship and his contending passion of narration? Hello, sir. Your audio is on.
Okay. Yeah. I just.
Should I repeat? He asked, what is the evolution of Walcott's craftsmanship and his contending passions of narration?
Yeah, see, essentially that question is about how his poetry is divided between a passion for English language and at the same time the understanding of what the English had done, I mean, through colonization to other places in the world. So it is not like Walcott is using the history of English colonization against the possibilities of English versification or English poetic craftsmanship. He's not repudiating it. Like, that is one way of doing it. Okay, like Chandramohan was asking, how would we contrast Braithwaite and Walcott? I would say Walcott was very clear about. Walcott said that there is this breed of poets who use the means of poetry, the medium of poetry, to write poems of recrimination, poems of despair, poems of rebellion, poems for the tradition that the colonizer has, the tradition that could be identified in some way with the colonizer, is being resisted, is being repudiated, who is being thrown out. They say the English tradition is not fit for us. You should throw it to the dustbin of history. You shouldn't be using it. Rather, you should rediscover the poetic traditions that were buried in the native soil. Like, look at all those African poets who as a means of rediscovering their self-respect, would repudiate, would reject English language writing, and then pick up an African language to basically talk to the world look at Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for instance. So in those places, when you connect Walcott with, or when you try to place Walcott in this, fame hall, the Hall of Fame of Black writers, the 21st century Black writers, the one essential difference is that this person doesn't think adopting certain languages, like to be precise, adopting the English literary tradition, adopting the aesthetics of English literary tradition, whatever English literary tradition offers. He doesn't think that his poetic craft is going to suffer from that kind of an adoption. So this is my answer to that. The contending forces that he has within him. There is a politics that he tries to say. The politics of the ancestral trace to human history. The politics which is not specifically responding to the wave of colonization that washed over the Caribbean islands. He's not specifically interested in that. It's not like he's throwing that history away. He uses that history. He does have very important poems on certain events, like the Mau Mau crisis, for instance. He has certain major poems on specific historic events, but largely he zooms out of the wave of colonization and tries to comment on certain existential tasks that he thinks that he must take on, like Whitman took on, like Neruda took on. He thinks his destiny, his predicament is aligned somewhere along those lines, and for that he thinks the language of the colonizer, or the language that he trains himself in as a poet, that doesn't appear as a hurdle to him, that doesn't basically block him.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. So there's a clarification that Cyrus Edwin needs. Which essay of Walcott were you speaking about? She missed the name, it seems.
The Muse of History.
Muse of History. So there's another question. Although he does not recriminate colonialism, isn't the way he has drawn Philostates from the edges of the Greek epic more than a recrimination to colonialism?
Yeah, of course it is more than a it is. He says he aligns with a group of poets whose task is more than writing a poetry of recrimination.
Yeah,
that is why I said he was not. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, sorry. He has an extension to it. I mean, is it not a direct onslaught to colonialist pretensions of owning history? So that's what he asks.
Yeah, it depends. Like, for instance, Homer is a name that was Latinized much later. It is historically, when we speak about these epics, we know that it is Homer. The Homer is basically Homer, and we know that this person, Homer, was not a white. He was not a privileged person. He was a slave. He was a wandering orator. He was not somebody like a privileged author. He was not a courtly poet, right? Homer was not a courtly poet. So the colonial forces, or say Rome, or later, for that matter, Britain, who belong to, or who think that this particular history is theirs, who think that these epics are theirs, there is a reclaiming. It is more like a. It's more in line with what he talks about. The ancestral trace. Like, for instance, he is connected to this bardic tradition. He is connected to a tradition of bard. Singing bards, for instance. Singing blacks, for instance. Homeros is basically his response in that light. It is not something he wants to take up a colonial epic. He doesn't look at it as a colonial epic in the first place.
Okay, sir. Okay.
So I'd like to ask a question if there is time now.
Yes.
Yeah. So actually, my question is about
Your audio was breaking.
Hello? So if you look at writers like Walcott or like say Salman Rushdie, there is this tremendous amount of effort to master the language like much better than what a white person
Yeah.
would have done. There is this pressure on the Indian English writer like someone like
Yes.
say Rushdie, or probably like the Caribbean writer like B.S. Naipaul, or most importantly Walcott, to possess language like it may not be attainable even for the white man to have that degree of command of the language. And is it some kind of, I don't know, I don't know, would you like to comment on this as some kind of pressure on a marginalized writer to make his voice heard globally? Is that a hurdle sort of thing? That is like that is so if Walcott is marginalized
Are you
because of the,
asking whether it is a hurdle?
yeah, but no, I'm trying to like I don't know, seek your views on contextualizing this commonality between many third world writers, like many writers like Walcott, like say Salman Rushdie or whoever, like they are under pressure to like write in the language such that the white man is amazed. Post that, they are taken seriously or something like that. There is this cultural politics of reading, the cultural politics of
Yeah,
visibility.
that is what
These writers are
we
under
think
pressure
when
to
we
like
look at it.
learn the language like no white man has ever learned, ever studied, and then write in it,
Okay.
so that
Okay.
what he wants to say is popularly canonized as globally visible, and now the world
But
is new.
but
I don't know.
but don't you think that is
That's
the
one
kind
thing.
of crisis that
Probably
yes.
like all the English teachers and all of you know a poet by name Kamau Brathwaite. He's also a poet of similar stature like Walcott. But
Okay.
if you look into the act of writing, the politics of act of writing poetry, is it true if I make a inference that Kamau Brathwaite suffered due to something like an experimentation? That is, he did have poems that are not easily digestible, like for the usual English reader. But Walcott, he has poems in the usual metric, in terza rima. For example, Omeros is in terza rima. Like he has poems in which it is the traditional conventional English that has been reinvented as per his aesthetics. But he is not really quote unquote experimenting as with voice, with size of font, with video accompanying poetry, etc. That Kamau Brathwaite attempted, and Kamau probably paid a price for this bravery in his act of writing. Probably he probably if Kamau Brathwaite was conscious of this, he could have written in the conventional free verse and become much more popular. Probably even won the Nobel Prize. And like we'll have like not that I idolize prizes. So if some writer like there is this worldwide news that this guy has won so and so prize, you might seek him out and read him. And like readers are enriched when somebody like say I don't know so for example like Marlon James wins a Booker Prize. So we chase like we seek him out, read him out, like then like we get a new awareness of Caribbean from him. So something like that, So I was just raising these two observations. Firstly, about language and Walcott. He is a subaltern writer under pressure, quote unquote pressure. Number one. Number second, did the great Kamau Brathwaite pay a price for experimentation in his writing? Those are my questions. Like all three of you, like anyone can like respond to it. Think out loud, whatever. Yeah. Thank you. That's my question.
Okay, I would invite other speakers to basically deliberate their points. I'll just say this. Do you think James Joyce actually felt a pressure when he had to write Ulysses or Portrait of the Artist as a young man in English, given the fact that he was Irish? Do you think Dylan Thomas would have felt the kind of pressure that he, that you're talking about, because he's Welsh and he had to prove his mettle in English language? Do you think Samuel Beckett would have undergone the same pressure? I mean, see, this pressure that we are talking about, look at Kamala Das, for instance. Kamala Das writes poetry in English, she writes prose in Malayalam. And she says, the way I write poetry in English, I write poetry in English because I think that is where my poetry fares well. So this is a choice that a poet makes. Now, if you choose a language first, then you're not understanding the poet, the craft of the poet. It is like the language should come to the poet much like the poetry that comes to him or her. And when you think that, when you see that your poetry is coming out well in English, it is only natural that you would try to sophisticate it. You would try to better it. This is the kind of exercise that, you know, Derek Walcott did. I mean, in my understanding of it. Braithwaite, on the other hand, he also found, his own vistas of experiments, which would have been like non-traditional, experimental, revolutionary, and like all revolutionaries, like all avant-gardes, he must have had a certain resistance from popular, like the popular readers. And anyways, like the avant-garde had never wanted to be popular. I mean, because avant-garde is basically categorically opposite to popular. Being an avant-garde writer, being a revolutionary writer, being an experimenter, I don't think Braithwaite ever thought that he would win the kind of popular applause that Walcott had won. But that said, every revolution, every avant-garde aesthetic move, in due course of time, becomes accepted by the general public, and maybe Braithwaite would find himself in a better, in popular reception in a few years. That's also possible. Given the revolutions that he brought into the aesthetics of poetry stays and is relevant in the coming few decades. People like Walcott, for instance, I don't think his popularity or his acceptance, even his Nobel Prize, came to him because he was playing to the tunes of English poetry and English establishment. Far from that. I mean, he was trying to, in my perspective, he was trying to do exactly what Dylan Thomas or Beckett or James Joyce had done with English language in the beginning of the 20th century. Late into the century, after post-colonial trends had set in, these people had, come up with another use. They're using English language. As I have told you in my talk, they were using their language to develop a whole new perspective on the new world. They looked at it as Eden. They looked at it as a land of possibilities, and they were cashing in on those possibilities, those poetic possibilities. Even Omeros is a result of that. Braithwaite was also doing the same thing, but then his ways of experimenting seemed more radical. That's all. And the second question that he had come up with also, I could link it up with the same perspective.
Okay, sir. So before moving to Somrita, ma'am, I would also contextually bring in that statement which Walcott himself made in an interview with the Paris Review in 1985, where he says, the English language is nobody's special property. It is the property of the imagination. It is the property of the language itself. I have never felt inhibited in trying to write as well as the greatest English poets. And interestingly,
Exactly.
the Nobel Committee, while awarding him with the Nobel Prize, says, they describe this work as a poetic oeuvre of great luminosity, sustained by a historical vision, the outcome of a multicultural commitment. So I think this speaks to each other. Like both these comments needs to be like looked into, like as we are discussing this. I think they are very pertinent.
Sure.
Yeah, probably to Somrita, ma'am, to add on to this discussion.
I was thinking of the question that Chandra Mohan raised for us, and it's really, really sort of exciting to be able to talk about it because, so I'm going to confess at the start that I've not read too much of Braithwaite. In fact, what I've read actually has come to me from Chandra Mohan. He introduced me to Braithwaite, and so I don't think I'm in a place where I can comment on his entire creative output. But this, this problematic of paying a price for experimentation. How do I think about it? How do I see myself in the process? Arunlalji was talking about how James Joyce was doing revolutionary things at the turn of the century with the English language. But James Joyce had also been, rejected by like 13 publishers before he was taken up, before the Dubliners was published. So a writer that we're more familiar with now, J.K. Rowling, she's also going around saying certain contested, but questionable things. So anyhow, we're not going into that. But J.K. Rowling had been, again, rejected by several publishers before Bloomsbury took up Harry Potter. So do you pay, I mean, I totally understand what Chandramohan is saying about sellability, and that's how a lot of publishers do approach their year. And, you know, that list that they come up with, that this is what we're publishing this year. Sellability is a very big idea. Marketability is a very big idea. And, you know, I could talk about this from my experience as a person that translates from Hindi and Bangla into English. And this is something I hear very often, where, you know, I will have an editor from, let's say, the UK, or an editor from the US who will say, oh, but, you know, there's something about your English which is not quite, you know, maybe the readers won't be comfortable with this. Maybe you should make it more. So, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are gatekeepers at place, these gatekeepers of the publishing industry. And I think they sort of, I actually don't want to sort of put the blame on the readers, because the readers will read what you are giving them as publishers, right? If the work is not published, if the work is not promoted, it won't reach the reader in all probability. I mean, of course, the process is more democratic now with the social media. So you can actually build a readership by getting your work out there. But I'm thinking about this from the sense of traditional publishing. There are gatekeepers at work. And, you know, these are gatekeepers. And as far as English is concerned, I couldn't comment on every other language or industry. But as far as the English publishing industry is concerned, these gatekeepers sort of have an idea of a very monolithic concept of English. It's a very white, hygienic, sanitized concept of English. And, you know, they don't really want to sort of make room for, you know, the quirks or the kinks of the English that, let's say, comes from Bengal, or the English that comes from Kerala, or the English that will come from South Africa. We find it a lot more difficult to be published in the UK or the US, because, you know, as publishers, they are going to stand there as a gatekeeper and say, this is not going to be accepted. So yes, I mean, you know, Chandramohan, you were talking about, you know, can we sort of like, so does winning the Nobel make you more readable? I don't know if it makes you more readable. It definitely makes you more sellable. You know, that's what prizes do for you. That's what, you know, big publishers can do for you. So I'm just going to like, just sort of, you know, wrap it up with that one sentence. Like, I see that message from Deepak over there. Should we continue to experiment, given that some writers meet with this fate? My answer would actually, it might sound idealized, but my answer would be yes, because I think unless we are sort of, you know, pushing the boundaries of language, pushing the boundaries of poetry, we will never be able to sort of really realize how far it can go. Because, you know, if we keep thinking about what we should do, then we will never get around to seeing what we can possibly do, right? So yeah, I mean, take chances, you know, experiment. And if you fail, it's sad, but it's okay. But like maybe the 10th person who's failing will be able to pave the way for newer experiments. I mean, that's how I like to look at it. I mean, and I would like appreciate big failures more than like mediocre successes. That's just me. So it's too idealized, but yeah, that's fair. That's how I think about it.
Maybe Rafael has something to add.
I'm sorry. I had it on mute. I was just saying, like, isn't that why the African writer series began? That's a question that one of the participants have asked to Somrita, ma'am.
The African Writers series, I'm sorry, could you talk to me a little bit more about that?
Okay.
Or if Rafael is aware of that, just in case, or Chandramohan, because I know they do follow a lot of African writers and work coming out of that. It's not something that I'm entirely sure of. If someone could just sort of take it up.
Should I answer Chandramohan's first question about?
Yes, you may, and then probably add to that.
So, well, I will also link up to what Somrita was saying about sellability, and to expand a little bit on that, because I think that Walcott and all the so-called first generation post-colonial writers like Achebe and Ngugi, they understood very well that if you wanted to be taken seriously by the literary establishment globally, you had to engage with the Western canon. Even better if you engage with the Anglo-American canon. So they understood that lesson, and they went for it, and that opened a lot of doors for them, and is nothing that they should be blamed for. It was their key to be taken seriously, as I say, by the literary establishment, and by that I mean not only the publishing houses, but the whole literary industry, the academia, and that's something that writers have done all the time. You can think about Adichie as well, or think about someone like J.M. Cossey, who has built a career out of this engagement with the canon. But I think that Walcott went beyond that, and this is what I was trying to say before, in the sense that he didn't only do that, but he also created his own epic language. So I think that for that he must be commended. But what I agree with Chandramohan, it's this kind of idea that it is a political choice to use a certain type of language and to choose who do you engage with. And so Braithwaite did that political choice, and Walcott did his political choice. But it is true that if you consciously refuse to engage with that particular canonical space, then you somehow push yourself out of the spotlight. I'm thinking about our local writer, Lesejo Rampolo Kang. He's the greatest genius we have today here in South Africa. But because of what he writes about, and because of how he writes in the English language, is totally ostracized by mainstream publishing houses, academia, and so on. So again, it is a political choice that writers, make. And if you consciously decide not to engage with the establishment, then, most often than not, the consequence is that you're not going to be celebrated by the establishment. You pay the price for it. So I don't know if that also answered Chandramohan's question, but thanks. It was really engaging.
Thank you, Raphael, sir. Thank you, Raphael, sir. So we have another question coming up. Vinod asks, Walcott crosses forms and genres with resourcefulness and meaning. But what about his courage of large utterance in language?
This person, Walcott, everybody has this, evolution as a poet, right? You move from one phase to another. It's not like, you keep writing the same kind of poetry for the whole career. So there was a phase when Walcott was trying to play around with poetic forms. He starts making small compositions. He comes up with, even Walcott's first collection was not, brought out by a major publisher. He had to self-publish it, if you know the history. So, this person did want a saleable kind of a format to establish himself as somebody who's read. It's like audience is the curse of a genius, definitely. So, he did crave for audience, and he did have that craving, even after he won his Nobel, he still had a craving for audience. When he kind of survived that, when he did feel so confident and comfortable about having won an audience, then he starts experimenting with his poetic prowess, and that is why you find him coming up with the sonorous, richly metaphoric translations that he makes from Latin literature, for that matter. He starts exploring other poetries, other cultures of poetries. He goes back into deeply European. He starts reading White Goddess, for that matter, Robert Graves' White Goddess. He takes up information from White Goddess, start trying to dig up into mythologies of early European cults. And naturally, his language changes, his poetry also changes. But that is like the fag end of his career. And he did not actually make much with that, if that is what you mean by this large utterance. He did not make a very significant impact with that kind of experimental poetry that he wrote by the fag end of his career. He is known for the shorter poems that he had composed in the earlier times, and definitely the middle phase of his career, which was politically impactful and definitely, creatively very, very rich, for that matter. I think I've answered that question. It's about a poet's evolution. You can't expect a poet to use the same kind of vocabulary and use the same kind of format to compose his poetry all through a career. He'll definitely evolve, or she'll definitely evolve. This evolution is part of perfecting one's career, one's vision, as it may.
Okay, thank you, sir. Somrita ma'am, do you have any concluding remarks?
Social media has come as a double-edged sword to us, but we can really use it to our advantage and reach out to a lot more readers that way. And it's a fairly more democratic process, at least if you think in terms of, traditional marketability and sales figures, distribution, stuff like that. So it could be more democratic. And I mean, yeah, I guess, this is something which came up at the beginning of this discussion, this panel. We were talking about traditions. And I think Arunlal ji spoke about it as well at one point, that, for any of us to break away from a tradition, it is necessary to know what that tradition is. So, I mean, I guess I'm just going to, in conclusion, if I had to say something, I would just say that we need to keep reading and we need to keep engaging to be better writers, because, and to be better sort of scholars, instead of, living in these insular spaces, and instead of taking the word, my word, or Rafael's word, or Arunlalji's word, anybody's word as the gospel. I mean, I think that idea of challenging, that idea of questioning is very, very key to anything that we read. So yeah, keep reading, keep challenging, and keep engaging, because that's how we'll keep pushing the envelope.
Thank you, ma'am. Over to Raphael, sir. So would you like to make some concluding point?
I just want to thank you for having me, guys, and just, in line with what Somrita would say, I would also say keep provoking, because we need spaces where people get provoked and where their certainties and their beliefs are shaken. And I think at least we try to do this today. Somrita certainly did. So thank you for creating this platform, to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raphael, sir. Over to Arun, sir. Would you like to make some concluding point?
Nothing much, the same thing that other speakers have told. Keep reading, keep thinking, keep making discussion platforms so that you can challenge yourself, your own convictions about stuff. Thank you for the platform, Chandramohan, and all the other organizers who have been part of this webinar. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you very much, Somrita ma'am, Raphael sir, and Arunlal sir, for the information of all the participants. This is second webinar themed on poetry. The first one was reading out poems by young poets, upcoming young talents in India. But we even had an Indian from UAE reading for us in the session. Following that was held last week, and following which now we were honored to have Somrita ma'am, Raphael sir, and Arunlal sir joining us for such a wonderful discussion. Thank you all.